the patients that got the surgery were getting just as good a results as the patients who didn't get the surgery or got the placebo effect.
You had a migraine as a child that
Yeah.
lasted over 2 years.
It affects maybe 1 to 1.5% of the population.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Mind blowing.
So the amount of B vitamins you could need could be not 2 times or 3 times or 5 times as much as someone else, but maybe 10 or even 100 times as much as someone else.
Do we all need to be taking supplements?
Just because you don't want to eat it doesn't mean your body doesn't need it.
Let's start out by talking about something completely fascinating, which is the placebo effect. What can we learn from it?
Yeah, excellent. So I think a tremendous amount. And I think what we can learn from it flips our understanding of traditional medicine on its head. So we'll get into that, but first let's start by defining what a placebo is. So placebo was historically been a sugar pill or likened to a sugar pill. The idea is it was an inert substance that researchers would study. So they'd give somebody a drug or a pill or an intervention they were studying on one arm, and then they have a placebo arm on the other side. And the idea was they'd want to make sure the intervention, the drug, the pill, the herb, whatever they're studying, is more effective than a placebo, right? And that was the kind of the criteria for any new drug to be approved, or any new surgery. You could use it for supplements, any kind of intervention you can study, but it was always studied against a placebo. So the question is why? Because what they found is this idea of a placebo effect. And what they found is up to a third of people will get better taking a placebo. So this drives researchers crazy, because if you're trying to get a drug better, the drug has to be better than a placebo. And obviously, if a third get better just from a placebo, that's a problem if you're trying to get a drug approved. So that's an obstacle in traditional medicine. But to us, and maybe in the more natural world, that is fascinating, right? If a third of people are getting better because of something intangible, that to me is not something to be ignored or a problem. That's something to be leaned into and studied, because what we're actually learning is we're actually getting outside that medical idea of something being mechanistic, which is a cause and effect that's very tangible and very physical. And what we've learned is that's actually not how things work. This idea of belief, this idea of trust, this idea of comfort, this idea of feeling heard and understood and having confidence in a doctor and an intervention in our health coach actually has a tremendous effect on our healing. And when we're facing a healthcare crisis or a disease care crisis, in the sense of the number one cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States is rising healthcare costs. If we have an intervention that costs literally nothing, right, and helps a third of the people get better, that's a fascinating area to study to help us lean into.
I'm so curious as to how this became part of your research. Did you have your own experience with a placebo?
You know what? Actually, how I got into this was I was fascinated about this spirit, mind, body connection. And I'd heard about the placebo, right? It always was kind of interesting to me. The one thing that really blew me away, I'll share this with you, was there was a study by as a gentleman named Mosley, and he was an Olympic team doctor for the basketball teams. I think for the Dream Team, he was actually the team doctor for the Houston Rockets, so a well-known orthopedist. And what he was doing was studying knee surgery. So it's specifically osteoarthritis or arthritis of the knee. And there's two main surgeries that they do. One is where they go in and they shave off the excess cartilage to try to smooth out the joint. And the second one is where they flush out the joint to get to clean it up. So two main surgeries: flushing out the joint and shaving off the cartilage to see which one improved function in the knee better, which one produced better results. But then, just for fun, they did a third, which was a placebo surgery or sham surgery. So you may be thinking, how the heck do you do a placebo surgery? Your listeners may be thinking. And so what they did for the placebo surgery, or what they for everyone, was they rolled them into the operating room. The doctors and nurses scrubbed in just like they were doing a surgery. And just before they made the first incision, they got a card. And it either said the equivalent of flushing, shaving, or placebo. So if they got it said flushing or shaving, they did the surgery just like they normally do. 40 minutes later, sew it up, send them off, do physical therapy, and they go into rehab. If they got the one that said placebo, They still made the incision, acted as if they were doing surgery, meaning the doctors were talking to each other, they were passing tools back and forth, but nothing ever happened inside the knee. Then they sewed it up. So as far as the patient knew, they still had a scar just like they got the surgery, and then they went back. And then they went and did physical therapy just like everyone else. And Dr. Mosley was curious. He wanted to know which type of surgery was most effective, the fleshing, the shaving, or the placebo. And what they found, shocked him. First of all, what he found is the shaving and fleshing were roughly equal, so there wasn't a big difference one way or the other. So so that was like, okay, that's kind of wasn't that groundbreaking, but that was a finding of the study. But what really blew him away was the fact that those who got the placebo fared just as well as those who got the actual surgery. So here he is, an Olympic team doctor, a team doctor for an NBA team, a renowned orthopedist, and he said, "I had to realize that all my skill as a surgeon was useless because the patients that got the surgery were getting just as good a results as the patients who didn't get the surgery or got the placebo effect." So that opened a whole other idea because when we think of something like arthritis in the medical model, it's like, hey, you can see it on the joint, right? They can put up your knee joint, they can show you the bones, they can say, here's the arthritis, here's your problem. We cut this out, we clean this up, you're going to be better. And here was a study that said, you know what? Actually, that wasn't as important, or that was equally as important as the patient believing they're getting better, as the patient having confidence, as the patient having a doctor look them in the eye and go through it. And it was actually the trust and the belief in their own healing that was actually the most transformational thing of all the interventions for the knee surgery.
How incredible are our
Yeah.
minds?
Yes. Yes. And I think that's exactly it, right? We have to get outside this idea that all that matters is matter, right? And that's kind of this traditional understanding of healthcare is all that matters is matter. Or said another way, if you can't touch it, if it doesn't show up on an X-ray or an MRI on a blood work, and things like your intention, your desire to get better, your mindset, those don't show up on X-rays, right? Those don't show up on blood work from the doctors. But what that study is showing and what the placebo effect shows, those are just as powerful, if not more powerful, than what we're doing every day.
Yes. I read something, I don't know if it was along the same lines. It basically had to
Mm-hmm.
do with plastic surgery
Uh-huh.
and how some people would have the surgery and they would see no difference, and other people, their entire lives would change.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's some fascinating interventions. I mean, I'm not familiar with that one in specific, but the idea of the idea of our beliefs shaping our reality. I think one example of that might be if, any of your listeners have thought about buying a new car and then all of a sudden for the next few days, all you do is see that car everywhere,
Yeah.
right? It's like what you put your attention on expands. And
Mhm.
sometimes, our mindset, our belief, it's almost like a pair of sunglasses that we're looking through, and how we're filtering the world has a powerful effect on what we see, what's real to us, and what we're observing. Right. And that power of mindset. It works, it works with healing, it works with looking at ourselves, it works with I'll give you one other example of that that's kind of coming to mind is they've actually studied just this idea of who lives longer, optimists or pessimists, right? And what they found is optimists live longer than pessimists. Okay, that makes sense, right? People are optimistic, you're in a higher mood level. And what they found is, depending on the study, they live 7 to 10 years longer, which is fascinating because things like having an ideal weight may add 1 to 3 years to your life. Normalizing your blood pressure, normalizing your cholesterol, wearing a seatbelt, all of them add 1 to 3 years to your life. So when you're talking about someone's mood level, their mindset, somewhere between 3 and 10 times more powerful than these things we're measuring, the medical system's measuring on every doctor visit: height, weight, you know, cholesterol, blood pressure, right? Those are things that are taken note of. Might ask you, do you wear a seatbelt? Are measured on every office visit, and yet it's these intangible factors such as mindset or mood level that science is showing are 3 to 10 times more powerful in terms of longevity than than things like blood pressure, cholesterol, or weight.
Mm. Yeah, I truly believe that we can do absolutely anything and that our
Yeah.
thoughts and our own minds are the only thing that stops us.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful idea. Tell me more about like where did that idea come from for you, or what was your journey to like find find that realization or come to that piece?
I think that was a download I had at one,
Yeah.
in a spiritual atmosphere at a, not really a church, but a center.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was just kind of like a realization. It was like, of course, yeah, I can do it's my own self that's stopping me. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, and it's clear because it's not just this woo-woo thing, because it's also been proven, like you're saying, all these different studies from science. I'm curious though, you had a migraine as a child that
Yeah.
lasted over 2 years,
Yeah.
which I cannot even imagine. I think the
Yeah.
longest I've had a migraine is maybe 2 hours. Uh,
Yeah.
what was that like, and what was the cause of it?
Yeah. So the slightly longer version, I suffered from migraines for about 9 years, but at its worst, it was, severe headaches. It was 2 years nonstop. And the way I know that is a doctor asked me to keep a headache diary, which I hated the idea of doing, which is like rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10 or something. I mean, just felt like nonsense to me. It's like, you don't understand. I always have a headache. So I literally did this for 2 years, and that's how I know how long it was. And um, but what was it like? So this is to orient you in my life. This is mid high school. So 16, 17, 18. So, um, I mean, just as anyone dealt with chronic pain, it was tough. I mean, it was dark. Like when I was, when I had a headache, like my family would know my mood level wasn't going to be as happy as, as when I was feeling well. And it's kind of like, just be careful what you say to Jeff when he's really sick and upset, because I would get just a little or a lot angry and kind of negative. So just, um, I would, I was still going to school. So when you have a couple of choices, like when you're in like kind of chronic pain, you stop your life and you kind of deal with it, or you just push through. And I'm just kind of a push through kind of person. So I would still go to school. I'd come home. I'd go for as long as I could till about 2 or 3 o'clock. For most of that time, I went to a full day. For part of it, for a couple of months, I did one period like remote learning, basically. So I'd be there for basically 6, 7 hours of the day, come home, lay on the couch for about 2, 3 hours. I'd get up and cook dinner. At this point, I was eating, I'd changed my diet about 2 years earlier. So cut out sugar, cut out dairy. So lived with my parents, and I had three younger sisters. So if I could eat what the rest of the family was eating, I'd have dinner with them or eat their food. Or if not, I learned to cook so I could do that kind of sugar-free, dairy-free kind of idea. So I do that. I lay back on the couch. Somewhere in there, I try to do 30 minutes of homework. And then I had heard of and then read the Norman Cousins book, Anatomy of an Illness. So I'd kind of try to watch something funny to make me laugh. So at that time, it was reruns of Whose Line Is It Anyway? I'd sometimes find on TV, like just to try to like lighten the mood level. Um, and then I'd go to bed like with a throbbing head and just kind of do it over again. And it was like, yeah, and that was kind of the cycle I was on. And I had to, at the worst of it, quit playing sports. Weekends were much the same as that. So it wasn't like, it was very limited and, going out or spending time with friends. And sometimes when they got bad, it was just like 2 or 3 days kind of, almost in a bed kind of thing. And that was kind of the cycle I was on for those couple of years. So that's what it was. What I what I found at that point was, um, I'd gone to see a chiropractor and I'd get some symptomatic relief. So if I had a headache that was a 7 out of 10, I'd get an adjustment and it'd go down to a 4. But what I really found helpful to build on top of that was adding holistic nutrition and just rebuilding my body piece by piece with different systems and organs in my body. About 8 years earlier, I had done, at the beginning of the headaches, I'd done a CAT scan of my brain, or the doctors had, a neurosurgeon did, and they found a mass in my brain. And then they did an MRI, and it turned out it was a benign cyst. So it was a growth in the brain, but not cancerous. Uh, and then they did about a dozen more MRIs over the next 10 years to make sure it wasn't growing. So there was a mass or a cyst in my brain. They weren't really sure what that was from. So at one point they talked about doing brain surgery to remove that to see if that was part of it. But so anyway, went through a whole bunch of stuff. But what I found effective was rebuilding my body piece by piece using holistic nutrition. And I'll tell you, at the same time, like in the midst of this, it was like that I was going to see some traditional doctors as well, and they'd put me on things like muscle relaxer, headaches pills. Immutrex was a class of tryptophan medications that came out for headaches in the early to mid 90s. So I would try, it was cycling through drugs, trying to find something that would help. And it never made sense to me that the medical doctors I would see, they'd do like a 10 to 15-minute appointment, and they'd give me 2 new drugs to try, but they could never tell me why I had the headaches, but they always had a solution for the headaches. So I remember even like in my early teens, I would ask, my mom or my dad, whoever was driving me to the appointment, is like, how can they know the solution without understanding the cause? Like that part never made sense to me. But at its worst, I just remember like laying in bed one day, just like a real severe depression. It's just like, and making a decision that said, like, I'm not going to go on living like this, which meant I'm going to figure this out and kind of feel better or else. And you didn't really want to think about the what or else meant, but it was just that decision of like, I can't keep going on like this because this wasn't even living. So that was kind of the beginning of this journey, because after going to doctors for 10 years or so, and it kind of not getting better, you get pretty frustrated. It's like you have a car that's not working, you go to the same mechanic for 7 years and the car still doesn't run. We probably wouldn't do that. Right. But sometimes with doctors, like, well, they're doing their best and kind of stuff like that. So there was a real like kind of turning point of decision at that point, was like, I'm not going on living like this. So, and if I have to figure it out myself, and that's when I started diving into try to learning, and that was 25 years ago or so.
Doing some self-diagnosis.
Yeah.
I'm curious, with your benign tumor in your brain, I would have been thinking the whole time, maybe this is causing it.
Yeah. So it was about 8 years old when I had it. It's called a congenital benign arachnoid cyst. So arachnoid's part of kind of the covering of the brain. It's one of the layers. And yeah, so I remember sitting in the neurosurgeon's office. His name was Dr. Wolf, and him telling me, in the medical system, they have say, here's the cause, and then they give you a treatment for the cause, right? It's like, here's the problem, and let's do that. So I remember them saying, finally, I'm like 3 years into the headaches at this point, 2 or 3 years, about 8 or 9 years old. And they said, okay, here's what we think is causing the headaches. It's this growth in your brain. I said, great. And they said, we're not going to do brain surgery. And I remember feeling crushed. I was like, what do you mean? I've gone through all of this. I'm on prescription drugs. I've gone through children's Tylenol, children's Advil, children's Motrin. I've gone prescription drugs. At this point, I've gone to a pediatrician, neurologist, now a neurosurgeon. I've done CT scan. I've done an MRI, and finally get to the point where they finally found something that they think could be causing the headache. And they said, yeah, we're not going to do anything about it. I was angry. Like, I was like, so now you feel like you're back to square one all over them. Now looking back, I could be very grateful they didn't cut into my 8-year-old skull. And I'm sure I've never really looked into all the complications of that specific type of brain surgery they can do. But I'm sure anytime you open up the brain, it's like not a low risk, option. So I'm very grateful for how things have turned out now. But at the time, I very much was on that feeling of like, you almost feel you're back at square one, but you just wasted 2 or 3 years to get to that point. That was my feeling at the time.
Yeah, I imagine that you would feel helpless, but then in hindsight, it's like that happened for you. Like,
Exactly.
yeah, thank you, God, universe, whatever was looking out.
Absolutely, because there's other ways that could have gone. And if any of your listeners are, football fans, or I know you're based in Florida, the old University of Florida football coach, Urban Meyer, who was then with Ohio State and over at Jacksonville, he has the same congenital cyst in his head. It affects maybe 1 to 1.5% of the population. So I've read about it some sense, and there's different ways they do. Sometimes they do surgery for it. Sometimes they actually put what's called a shunt, or they basically put a little tube that drains the excess fluid from the brain out of the brain, like maybe into the head and neck area. So there's a couple of different things they can do, but he actually retired twice from coaching because of the severe headaches he had that was attributed to this. So anyway, it's just an interesting counterpoint. I can look at, other people have had that, and he happens to be one of the more notable ones that I've seen with
Mhm.
it. So you kind of look at what things could have been if I didn't go a different approach and kind of look for more of the underlying cause with it.
Wow, I wonder if the other people that have it, if they were given the option of the brain surgery, or if they were also told we're not going to do that, and so now they're kind of just suffering through it, not finding the solutions that you did. Which I imagine, okay, you're seeking for a root cause. They're not really giving you what that is. They're just giving
Yeah.
you different ideas of what could help with the symptoms. And then you find, okay, the root cause could be the surgery, but you're not going to do the surgery. So now let me self-diagnose and go down this rabbit hole and figure out what to do to help myself. And then you found that the chiropractor was helping, but it wasn't actually completely alleviating it, and it was temporary. And then you dove more into nutrition.
Yeah, exactly. Then I jumped more into nutrition and kind of rebuilding the body. And I first saw a practitioner who did kinesiology or muscle testing just to kind of
Mhm.
evaluate the individual weaknesses of the body and kind of find out the specific areas. And one of the main organ systems that started out supporting was the cardiovascular system, or the heart, and just giving good quality nutrition for the heart and kind of rebuilding it that way. But through that hit a whole bunch of systems, especially including, adrenals, digestion, and just rebuilding the body kind of step by step through that
Mhm.
process.
Amazing. Okay, so you started by eliminating dairy and sugar, and
Sugar
where
and
did you go?
dairy. Yeah, so
Mhm.
that was maybe 1998. So I was about 13 years old. Um, so yeah, so I remember sitting in the doctor's office, and he said, "So I'd like you to cut out sugar and dairy." And I remember looking at him and say, "Okay, so what's left?" Like that was my understanding. Like we didn't eat horribly, like fast food wasn't a regular thing. We didn't have a lot of soda at the house, but it was, we'd have things like, maybe fried chicken and mac and cheese. My mom would cook a decent bit, but it wasn't, but I didn't have that level of understanding to know. I remember asking him, like, are eggs dairy? And he's like, no, they don't come from a cow. And I was like, okay, that makes sense, but they're right next to each other in the grocery store. So at 13, I didn't know the difference, right? So it was a beginning, a process of literacy to actually figure out what could I eat. And, this is, 25 years ago at this point. So the health food options and how they taste now are very different than, in the late 90s, like half the stuff tasted like cardboard, so you had to go through and just find out what stuff was good and what stuff wasn't good. And kind of go through it. But that was the beginning of the process. Since then, um, really what I do now, or what that's evolved into, is really limiting grains as well. Probably, you know, a base of what I drink would probably be water. I mean, that would probably be a base, a little bit of green tea every once in a while, but really cutting out sugar and dairy. And, like I said, that was 25 years ago. If I was to do it now, probably going gluten-free or cutting out grains, or refined grains would be what I would add to it at this point if I was doing it all over again.
Mhm. I remember on my own health journey, the first thing I was supposed to cut out was gluten.
Yeah.
And I kind of the same response, being like, gluten's in everything. And I can't
Yeah.
even tell you how many hours I spent like reading ingredient labels and looking up like what is gluten? Like,
Yeah. And then the hidden names for it, right? Because there could be like 50 AKAs for gluten. Then you're like, how can I not have ketchup? Right. Or whatever that food happens to be. But sometimes where it is just like almost shocking on where you find it.
yes, yeah, it's learning about food, which it should be common knowledge, but not where we are. Speaking of, you talk about nature's perfect food. What would you say is nature's perfect food?
Well, the example I give in the book when talking about that is breast milk from mom. And the reason I say it's nature's perfect food is because it's totally customized to the baby. So in a hotter climate, it has a lot more water content. At the beginning of life, it's very high in probiotics. It actually helps colonize the gut. And when the baby's getting sick, it's rich in immunoglobulins, or kind of supporting the baby's immune system.
Mm.
And you know, For boy babies, it's got about 25% more calories to support them gaining weight and growing. So what you find, and is if a mother is nursing two children at the same time, then the milk will be different for each child depending on its
No.
individual needs. Yeah, so it's this incredibly customized and very dynamic food, and there's actually communication going on between mom and baby, whether it's happening through the saliva or happening energetically or happening both. It's this incredible dynamic feedback system for mom giving baby exactly what baby needs and baby communicating to mom what it needs.
Wow. Okay. The male female thing is blowing my mind, because what if you have a set of twins and one's a boy, one's a girl?
Yeah, what they're saying, what they found is that the milk you give to each child is different.
Wow. Okay. That's
Yeah,
mind blowing.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then also though, what do you think about people who didn't get breastfed as a child, who, went straight to formula? I mean, I feel like they have a disadvantage as far as their upbringing, the way that their bodies developed.
Yeah, so I think it's, is it a disadvantage? Yes. Is it unovercomable? I would say no. But certainly it's, you know, certainly there is, I was born, I'll give you an example, personal example. I was born C-section, right? Because of that. So I don't have the benefit of starting off with a good microbiome by passing through the vaginal canal, getting that first dose of good bacteria. So I'm behind the eight ball from that standpoint. Does that mean it's not overcomable? Oh, but certainly is there best practices on how we've evolved, as a species to help us best survive? And yeah, and part of that is, certainly a vaginal birth. Part of that is certainly breastfeeding, but some people can't, don't want to. Mom has some health conditions, you know, different things to handle. So I'd say if it's all possible, do it. And if not, we have to understand what are the nutrients lacking, and how can we best do it. And when I work with moms kind of in that situation for whatever reason, probably what we want to do is eschew or stay away from conventional formula, right? Most conventional over the kind of formula is not, garbage. And then we'll try to build our own formula, which can be more work, but use something with the goat's milk, which is very similar in nutrient composition and macros to breast milk. And then you got to supplement it with things like DHEA or some probiotics or, some prebiotics. And there's a formula to kind of customize that to try to make something that's the functional equivalent of breast milk. But the thing you're never going to get to that is the dynamic nature of it. You're never going to get the, hey, it's hot outside, so there's more water content in the milk. Or, hey, it's colder outside, so we're going to have more fat content, so the baby's got more energy to stay warm, right? That's what we'll never be able to duplicate. Just like somebody taking maybe thyroid medicine won't be able to ever get that same dynamic nature that the body has with the feedback mechanism between the adrenals and the pituitary and the hypothalamus. We can do our best, but nature or the body has a pretty incredible system.
Definitely. I wonder if the body affects it in some way, if it isn't already optimal before it's being drank, like if the body can do something to it once it's inside of you. It also reminds me of I've learned that when you grow your own herbs, that it creates a certain, it basically, I don't know if it's the bacteria that's on it, but
Hmm.
whatever that person's body needs. So if you grow your
Hmm.
own, what you're going to be getting from those herbs is exactly made for you.
Wow. Yeah, it's fascinating. I think there's so much, and this is kind of the idea of quantum physics, which basically says that there's a lot more happening at the energetic level. They said like the basic formula that kind of Einstein made famous was E equals mc squared. So basically E is energy, M is mass, and C is the speed of light. But basically energy equals mass and mass equals energy. So what we see, I'm talking to you. I got a desk here. There's walls. This is solid, right? This all looks very real. But the idea that this table is basically made out of energy, right? These walls are made out of energy. And the way we know that is they're made out of, you know, elements, essentially, which are made out of atoms. And what quantum physics tells us is that the atom is 99 0.9996% empty space. So what does that mean? It means if, the nucleus is the size of a mini basketball or the size of a big softball here, the closest electron might be 6 kilometers away, right? Which could be outside. I'm in a small town, so that's like outside the town limits, right from here. And that's just an idea of how much empty space is in the atom. Although that space isn't empty, it's actually full of energy. And that gets us back to the conversation we started with the placebo and with the power of mood level. Because actually what the mood level is, it's the energy, or it's the particle flow animating the body, right? And so we can look at that. And you said, so can the body like change the food that's coming in it? And I'd say we absolutely can have an energetic effect on that. And the particles flowing through our body can actually change our nutrient requirements. And that is probably a wild thing to say if we're used to looking at the RDAs. But even conventionally, it's well known that like under stress, we need more magnesium. Like a cycling woman needs more iron, right? A weightlifter needs more protein. So the idea that we have nutrient needs that are dynamic is actually not applied, but actually common sense, right? We all know that if some dude's walking the gym at 280 pounds and he's like 4.5 feet wide and 5.5 feet tall, like he's going to need a lot of protein to maintain that. And a woman who's, cycling needs more iron to replace the blood loss. And we intuitively know those things, but none of that's going to show up on the side of on the package where it says the RDA, or the recommended daily allowance. And there was work by a gentleman named Roger Williams, and he was a researcher and actually professor at University of Texas in Austin, and he discovered 2 B vitamins, and his brother discovered a third. So these guys were like, really important in the area of biochemistry. And he wrote a book that's called Biochemical Individuality. And what he said is individual nutrient requirements vary from person to person, which we know, like your nutrient requirements can be different than mine, which can be different than a young child, which would be different than vary up to 100x person to person.
Oh, you
See,
froze for a moment.
up.
Okay, so you were saying that our nutrient requirements differ.
Okay, so nutrient requirements can vary. Mine might be different than yours, might be different than a child, might be different than grandma's. And that's pretty much well known. But what's unique about is the extent of that difference. What he found is that nutrient requirements could vary 75 or up to 100x person to person. So the amount of B vitamins you could need could be not 2 times or 3 times or 5 times as much as someone else, but maybe 10 or even 100 times as much as someone else. And it's the stresses of life that can change that. So, can we change the food? Possibly. And also, can the way we're living life change our nutrient requirements? An example I like to give with patients is just imagine our body is like a boat in the water, right? And the more stress there is, the bigger the waves hitting the boat. And we can imagine that the bigger the waves hitting the boat, the more we're going to have to do like repair and maintenance on the boat, right? If the boat's in calm water, we don't have to do much fixing. We won't need a lot of nutrients to repair the boat, right? But the more stress we're under, the more the waves are crashing, the more we're in the middle of a hurricane, the more nutrients we're going to require, the more protein, the more building blocks, the more vitamins, the more minerals we're going to need to survive that stressor and rebuild the body. And I think that's a really underappreciated part of nutrition, is just how much that stress nutrition interaction, and how when we're under more stress, there's certain nutrients we're going to need more of to survive the stress and then to rebuild after it.
Sticking on the topic of nutrients, but going back to dairy for a moment, I know dairy was one of the first things that you omitted from your diet. Mother's breast milk is nature's perfect food. What do you think about milk for adults?
Yeah, good question. I'm open to the idea of raw dairy being a healthy food for people. Some people are still sensitive to it, of any kind of dairy. Dairy is one of the 4 most common allergies that I see with people. So I think some people still have an issue regardless, but if it's going to be healthy, it's going to be a raw dairy. That's going to be the way to do it. But anything that's pasteurized, homogenized, from milks fed growth hormones, and fed, junky food, I think that is anything but a health food. I mean, what pasteurized basically means is cooked. It comes from Louis Pasteur, right? The French microbiologist, but pasteurization is basically the point, they cook it to the point it denatures proteins. So the benefit of that is it kills off the bacteria that are in there. So it's sterile. The bad news is it denatures the protein, so they're not as digestible and usable. So the quality protein you're getting in the milk isn't going to be bioavailable or biousable to the body. So that's the downside of it. So with raw milk, you get that. There's a concern about it, there's a concern about, and the other thing is there's a concern about the quality of raw milk. So you're going to want to make sure it comes from a quality farm, where they're, humanely raised cows and they're not sick and things like that, where when you cook it, you can hide all that stuff, right? The cows don't have to be healthy. You can have all kinds of disease in there, and they basically just heat it up. It's like boiling water from a stream, right? You just cook it all. It hides everything in there, and it doesn't have to be healthy. And then all of that junk, it might be dead, but you're still eating it, versus a raw milk can be a better option. So that's the long answer. The short answer is I'm open to the benefits of raw milk and raw dairy, but if dairy's done, it needs to be that. And there are still some people that are sensitive to any kind of it, because our ability to digest proteins in dairy does drop about 90% at age 2. So the amount of enzymes we have to digest, dairy proteins, which is roughly, give or take, when somebody would begin to wean, breastfeeding wise. So there is some like historical precedent for that, but open to raw dairy's benefits, and most of the pasteurized dairy, just get rid of it.
I'd have to agree with you, but do you ever personally go back and test the waters to see maybe I can bring in some quality dairy now?
You know what? I'll have to tell you, I'm my heritage is Italian, so I did the 23andMe, and so I'm 90% Italian. So the idea of having good quality cheese and things like that. The milk doesn't really bother me. I haven't really had any in 25 years, but a good quality cheese or something like that, or a pizza, something I can very much appreciate and what I found for me works better is pretty much staying away from it, because if I start to have it, I'll really want it. So I might have it, on occasion. But I find so for me, it's like a treat. But if I have it too often, then I'll start craving it, and then it's just a little bit of a slippery slope for me. So that's kind of what I found. How about you?
Yes. So when the raw dairy world started picking up, and I read and I saw the benefits that other people were getting from it, and I grew up loving milk. Of course, it was always pasteurized in
Yeah.
our house, but I loved it. And I get my produce from a local farm here, and they always have raw
Oh,
butter,
awesome.
raw milk, and things like that. So I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna try it. I'm just gonna try it and see what happens. I haven't done dairy in years.
Yeah.
I also don't do eggs. My body just doesn't do well with them.
Yeah.
And yeah, I had one sip of because you have to kind of tiptoe to really test it correctly. And
Sure.
you also don't want to overdo it and then just have a whole bunch of health issues. So I
Yeah.
just had a sip, and the next day I had a cyst on my
Mm.
body. Here's the thing is I had skin
Wow.
issues before,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
yeah, so that's why, dairy feeds those a lot of times,
Yeah.
acne and cystic acne and things like that.
For
So
sure.
it was just one sip, and it was the next day. It was so odd, because even when
Yeah.
I had cystic acne, I didn't have it on my body. I only had it on my face. So I
Yeah.
was just like, okay, and my body knows it's
Yeah.
not having dairy.
Yeah. I think I think we talk about skin issues with dairy, certainly digestive issues, diarrhea, constipation, and then asthma, difficulty breathing, mucus, congestion. Those are some of the most common things I see with a dairy allergy. And that's been my experience. Some people go to raw dairy and are okay, but it's not an insignificant number of people that'll tell me, even when I have raw dairy, I'll still be coughing more. I'll still have congestion. I'll still have, a little bit of diarrhea or a little bit of constipation. So one is that's a sign, okay, so maybe there's some work to rebuild the gut and work on digestion and things like that, which can be an invitation to do that. And the other thing it tells me is it is one of the foremost common allergies, right? Along with it's dairy, wheat, gluten, and corn, and soy. Sorry, dairy, wheat, or gluten, corn, soy. Those are kind of the four most common allergies. And what I'll have someone do is experiment cutting all those out and then introducing them one by one. And then once you see what that is, then you just say, okay, I'm better off without this. And there is a wide variety of foods to have without that. But that's that. What you did is like a brilliant thing that I want someone to do, which is begin to reconnect and have that communication with their body and just say, hey, what does it feel like when a food is really serving me and in alignment with my body and giving me nutrients? And what does it feel like when a food not doing that? And then it's a matter of, are we willing to listen to that? So I think that's a great process. And sometimes I'll give someone the homework of eliminating those 5 stressors, or we have a more expanded list of 15 for up to 5 days, and then just slowly building back in. And there can be a whole elimination diet which can be more strict and up to 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, and certainly there's benefit of that. But I think most of the time you can see changes within, cut them out for 3 to 5, cut it out for 5 days, right? 3 days, 5 days, and then add it back in on the 6th, and on the 7th day you'll know. Right? Just like you said, like if you're in tune with your body and you're willing to look at that, right? The signs are there. And I think if we recognize our, like, the best doctor lives within, right? And we validate that instead of always looking from on the outside for the answers, really positions us in a powerful way to be more agents of our own healing journey and more cause of our own health.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, if we listen to our own bodies, we really don't need anyone else's advice. And that's the one thing I've learned after so many years. And an elimination diet is, I mean, that will change your life. I believe everyone needs to do an elimination diet, whether it's 7 days or 30 days. It's such a short amount of time in the large scheme of things. And you learn so much about yourself and your body. And I mean, you're going to be eating for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So it's a good idea to figure out, what your body doesn't want.
Yeah. And then one other thing I'd add on that is sometimes it's good to check in on that every 6 months or a year or 2 years, because I know for myself, I'll do that, eat really good for 3 months, 3 weeks, whatever it is, and then start experimenting. And then you experiment with this, and then you experiment with that, and then all of a sudden going all the way back to basics and doing it again. Because one, the body will change, but two is like going back to those fundamentals can be really powerful. And just like as a reminder, like, oh yeah, actually, I did feel like this, or I did feel better. And you just keep going back to the basics, because there is tremendous power in what you just said.
Yes, because we also forget that.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because sometimes it tastes good, or sometimes we want, or sometimes we get out of our habits, or we move, or we travel, or whatever happens, and it's easy to, like you said, I mean, you said it so simply, but it's easy to forget. And then that's the power of putting those disciplines to remind us of what the best steps are for us on a healing journey.
Yeah, and if you want to take it a step further, then you can also keep a food journal, so then you don't forget as easily.
Yeah, exactly. And then you got to just go back and review it, or put it on the fridge so you know exactly, with some notes of like, here's the best practices for me.
I am wondering if you are pro or anti supplements.
Good. So mostly pro, but most supplements on the market, I'd say anti. So what I'd say is, what most people don't realize is, no matter who makes the supplement, the raw materials for each supplement, I'm talking about the vitamins, the synthetic vitamin C, the synthetic vitamin D, the synthetic vitamin E, the alpha tocopherol, the ascorbic acid, comes from one of 5 made pharmaceutical companies. So the same people that make the drugs are also making the synthetic vitamins that go in the supplements, and they're mostly making them out of, genetically modified corn or petroleum products. So most supplements, I would say, aren't taking us closer to health. What I am a fan of is a whole food diet and supplements that reflect a whole food diet. So the ingredient list on your supplement should be things like, sweet potato, nutritional yeast, organ meat, depending on what it is, good quality, pea vine juice. I mean, you should be able to read your supplement label and be able to recognize those things from foods. And then there's certain herbs that can be helpful for sure. And then you always want to look at quality. And most herbs have what's called something called a marker compound, which is the active ingredient in it. So with something like echinacea, the main marker compound is called alkalinamides. So the best echinaceas are standardized by their alkalinamide content, which means no matter where it's grown in the world, no matter what the soil conditions, no matter what time of year or things like that, they're guaranteeing that is a certain amount of the active ingredients. So I know as a practitioner that if I give you echinacea, no matter, it's going to hit a certain quality threshold, and I'm going to understand what those results are going to be on you. So most supplements in the grocery store, most supplements out there, even at GNC, I'd say throw them in the garbage. They're not good for you. But there are certain supplements that are food-based that are in alignment with a whole food-based diet that I found incredibly helpful and therapeutic.
Do we all need to be taking supplements?
So that depends. That depends on you. That depends on your goal. Is it possible? So I think it depends on two factors. One is the quality of the diet, and two is the quality of the stress you're under. In my experience, I think most people could benefit from adding some things, from supplementing with different parts of their diet, because statistically something like more than half the people are deficient in magnesium. So are we eating, and where does that come from? Dark green leafy vegetables. Organic ones will have a little bit more in them. If you're growing them and they're controlling them from the soil, that'll be good. 98% of Americans are going to be deficient in what's called omega-3s, or those good quality healthy fats. So is it possible to do it that way? Yes. And I'll give you the best case scenario. The best case scenario comes from Weston A. Price. So he was a dentist, wrote a book on dental disease, and then his son got dental disease, and he realized, well, I actually know how to diagnose dental disease, but I don't know how to prevent it. So he spent about 10 years traveling the world and looked at, populations as far as New Zealand, the Scottish Highlands, the plains of Africa, and looked at their natural diet. And what he found is all of those natural diets, some were like the Inuit up in Alaska was almost all, what we'd call keto, or almost all carnivore, right? 95% plus animal products, and some were largely vegetarian. He never found anyone that was totally vegetarian. He didn't find an ancestral diet that was totally vegetarian, but some were much more vegetable based with less amounts of meat. And what he found is the nutrient requirements, they've studied each of those populations. What they found is the nutrient requirements of the natural diets were all had between 2 and 10x the RDAs. So they all had much more than they need compared to the standard American diet, or the diet of the American Heart Association, or the diet of like the American Diabetes Association, all of which had 20 to 60%. So there is a natural wisdom that we don't necessarily need to read medical textbooks or nutrition textbooks to understand health, because actually there's a natural wisdom within us to be able to do that. I do think even within that, because of the individualization we each have, because of the fact that nutrient requirements can vary 50, 70, 100x, that we either need to be real in tune with those individual differences and the dynamicness there, or work with someone who helps us do that. And whether that's customizing the diet or whether it's customizing nutrition protocol, I definitely believe in my experiences that nutrient levels change and requirements change based on the stresses we're under, based on the activity we're under, and based on how we're handling things. But the best supplements are really foods, right? And I think that's the point to really go to. You can get it from your diet. Some people might not want to eat liver. They might not want to eat fish 5 times a week. They might not want to eat things like nutritional yeast. But just because you don't want to eat it doesn't mean your body doesn't need it. So we got to find a way to get it in you one way or the other.
Just because you don't eat it doesn't mean your body doesn't need it.
Exactly. Yep, you got it.
You wrote a book called Timeless Youth. It contains 5 key principles that your practice and your life are built on today. What are those?
Yeah, so what I wanted to do was understand the there's so much conflicting information in the area of nutrition. Like there's this miracle supplement, and then next month there's going to be some other miracle supplement, and then there's this new product on the market. And it was trying to figure out, like, how do you figure out what actually works or what actually makes sense? So what I came up with, so the 5 principles are, the first one is what I call the Yellowstone principle, and that is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's the idea of the medical system is very much based on a reductionist approach, but actually, how do we apply the holism approach? And I talk about how to apply that to supplements, how do we apply that to community, how we apply that to stress, and I go through that. So that one's the first one. That's the first one. The second one is what I call the Model A principle. And the Model A was, well, Ford made the Model T in the early 1920s. And in 1926, 1 out of every 3 cars sold was a Model T. Actually, 2 out of every 3 cars sold in the United States was a Model T. So it was the single most popular car, and you can get it any color you wanted as long as it was black, and just like every other car, right? So the idea is it was a great benefit to Henry Ford because it enabled him to streamline the assembly line process, right? He was able to make cars quicker and cheaper, and famously he painted them black because black dried 2 hours quicker than any other paint. So it was all about, speed and efficiency in that system. And fortunately or unfortunately, the medical system is very much based on that. It's almost like assembly line medicine, right? Which works if you assume that all the people are the same, right? The only way I can do a doctor's appointment in 3 to 5 minutes or 7 minutes is assume that you are the same as every other person that came in before you. And I only have to ask a few questions to find a few differences, but you're basically mostly the same. The problem is we know we're all unique. We know we have unique stories. We know we have unique histories. We know we all have unique challenges. We have unique stressors. We have unique wants. We have unique goals. So that's what I call the Model A principle. So eventually, the Model T went away, right? The sales dropped so much they were forced to retire it, and they replaced it with something called the Model A. And when Ford introduced the Model A, customers had a choice. They had options, they had colors, they could finance it, they could choose different body styles, right? There's different price points, different uses, and different customizations. And that's the Model A principle, is how do we bring back, it's basically the one size fits all approach is what we know doesn't work, but how do we bring this dynamic individualization back to the healthcare industry? So that's the Model A principle. And then I go into what I call the quantum principle, which is basically the power of, all that matters isn't matter. There's a level behind that, which we started to talk about with mood level. I get into what's called the Olympic principle, which is how do we use stress to make us stronger? And then finally, the principle of the golden U, which we each have this incredible ability to heal locked up inside us. And how do we unlock it? How do we release it? How do we tap into that? And how do we maximize that healing potential each of us have? Because knowing that the greatest doctor is inside you. And regardless of what therapy you're using, what surgery you're using, what nutrition you're using, what supplement you're using, what doctor you're going to see, acupuncture, nutrition, physical therapist, occupational therapist, massage, Reiki, right? There's all kinds of different incredible modalities out there. And yet all of them only work to the extent they unlock your own body's ability to heal. So how do we maximize that? So that's that final chapter, the golden U principle.
Okay, people want the book, people want to learn more, where can they go?
Well, awesome. I'd love them to read it and share it with their friends. And to do that, you can go to Amazon. You can search Timeless. You can go to timelessyouthbook.com, or if you have a favorite local bookstore, you can go there and they'll have it, or they can order it. And if anybody listen to this in English but reads in Spanish or has friends that read Spanish, it came out in Spanish last year as well. It's called Tu Eterna Juventud, and you can find it there as well. So timelessyouthbook.com or Amazon by searching Timeless Youth Book or my name, Jeff Crippen.
Great, and we will have those links in the description. I have one final question for you, which is, what is your number one health tip? So whether that's diet, nutrition, mindset, emotional, physical, the one piece of advice you would like everyone to know.
Yeah, I was thinking of this when I listened to some of your episodes. So I've been thinking about what I wanted to share on that. I think what I want to do is go back to where you started with that question of mood level, and where we started with optimist versus pessimist. And the question the advice I would give was ask yourself when you wake up in the morning, describe your mood level, right? And just spot the mood level you're in, whether it's anger, whether it's frustration, whether it's depression, whether it's happiness, joy, excitement, seriousness, loss, confusion, whatever. Just simply naming the mood level has a powerful effect on your body. As an example, you can't, if you're locked in the bathroom of the house, you can't describe what the outside of the house looks like by looking at it, unless you're doing it by memory, right? But once you get out of the house, you can describe what the house looks like. And by simply naming the mood level, what they found is you're actually get forced to get outside the mood level to describe it. And one study I'll share with you on that, there's an MRI study, and they showed people pictures that were either like beaches and sunrises and mountains that were like calming, relaxing, healing pictures, or they showed people pictures that were violent and war, like destruction or threatening pictures. And then they asked them, they looked at which part of the brain's lit up. So with the relaxing, calming, happy pictures, the part of the brain that lit up was the prefrontal cortex, which regulates things like rational thought. And when they showed the threatening pictures of terror or anger or violence or war, the part of the brain that lit up was called the amygdala, which is the center of the fear response in the brain. But then they asked the person to name their mood level they were feeling. And what they found when they were shown the pictures of war and violence and threatening and terror, when they asked the person to name the mood level they were feeling, I feel scared, I feel unsafe, I feel confused, I feel overwhelmed, whatever it was, the part of the brain that was lighting up on the functional MRI changed from the amygdala, or the fear-based part of the brain, to the prefrontal cortex, or the rational part of the brain. So just by naming the mood, it was changing the dynamics of the brain and helping separate them from that fear response and get them more at cause over it. So the suggestion would be, describe the mood level you're in. And if you're waking up in a great mood in the morning, give yourself a pat on the back. And if not, simply know that simply naming that mood is beginning to release you from it. And if you want to add on to that, a short gratitude process at the end of the day, or at the beginning of the day and end of the day, can help naturally bring the mood level up and program you to look for the good in the world, look for what you're appreciating, look for what's on the positive side of it, and will help bring that mood level up in a natural way.
Dr. Jeff Crippen, thank you so much. This could have honestly been a 3-hour episode. I should have asked you beforehand if you had that much time. But I really love your message here. I love the empowerment piece behind it. We could all use that. And everyone go grab a copy of the book. I love it. It's phenomenal. And you can find the links in the description. And thank you so much, Dr. Jeff Crippen.
Awesome. Thank you. Pleasure to be on with you and your audience. And yeah, we'll continue the next 2 hours of our 3-hour episode in the future.
Yes, thank you.